I'll accept, but only this time, okay?
She took the job for money. The pay was high enough to ignore the warnings. The problem was the patient, a mobster, cold, impossible, the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to destroy someone. His silence alone was enough to change the air. 15 caregivers had been through that apartment before her. None stayed. Some left quickly, others in silence, without explanation, without looking back. But Neve stayed, and that's when it began. Something she couldn't name, as if the harder he was, the more impossible it became to leave. Chapter 1. The Offer That Changes Everything. I knew something was wrong before I even opened the door. There was no noise coming from the apartment, and Finn always had some noise, whether it was the TV turned up too loud or the kitchen faucet he left dripping without noticing. The silence in the hallway was different from the silence of an empty home. It was the silence of someone quiet on purpose. I went in. 2 men were sitting in my living room like the couch belonged to them, and Finn was in the corner armchair with hunched shoulders and his eyes on the floor. One of the men was too broad for the space, as if the apartment had been built with the wrong measurements. The other was younger, with an expression of boredom that only works when you've done this many times before. Finn raised his eyes for a fraction of a second, enough for me to understand the problem was serious. "Neve Calloway," the older one said, without getting up, without extending his hand. "Good thing you're here." I walked in, closed the door calmly, and stood in the middle of the living room. I didn't sit down. I wasn't going to sit down in my own home like I needed permission to do it. "I don't remember inviting anyone," I replied, and my voice came out in the exact tone I wanted, firm, without provocation, without fear. The older man took an envelope from his pocket and placed it on the coffee table, between a forgotten cup and the stack of mail Finn never opened. 32,000, 30 days, no questions. He stood up slowly, and the other one followed, like a trained reflex. "Mr. Morrow asked me to tell you he has patience, but not infinite patience." They left. The door closed. The envelope remained on the table like a sentence printed on paper. Finn was still in the armchair, staring at the floor, when I positioned myself in front of him and waited until he raised his eyes. He took his time. When he did, the expression I found was shame, and his shame in that moment wasn't enough to hold back my anger. $32,000, I said slowly, so each word occupied the space it deserved. "That's what you owe." "Naive, I know that." "No." I raised my hand and he closed his mouth. "Don't tell me you know, Finn. Because if you knew, those men wouldn't have been sitting on our couch." He got up from the armchair, an instinctive gesture from someone who wants to take up space when being pressured, and started saying he would fix it, that he had an idea, that he knew someone who could help. The words came out stumbling over each other, each one trying to fill the hole the previous one had opened. I listened to him. I listened to every promise, every plan he believed while inventing it. And when he finished, I was still in the same place, arms crossed and patience at its limit. "You're 21 years old with a debt to a loan shark who sends men into our home," I said. "You don't have an idea. You don't have someone. You don't have anything that solves this in 30 days except real money." My voice didn't shake, but my chest hurt. "Our mother died 2 years ago, Finn. I dropped out to take care of you and pay the bills for this apartment. I didn't ask for anything in return. But this right here, I can't ignore." He went quiet. The silence between us was different from the silence before. It was the silence of someone who heard and has no answer. I picked up the envelope from the table, opened it, and looked at the numbers printed inside. $32,000 in 30 days. "I'll handle it," I finally said, but without the anger from before. The anger had transformed into what it always transforms into when you love someone who insists on hurting themselves. Exhaustion. But from now on, Finn, no more gambling. None. Anything I find out, I'm done. And you deal with it yourself. Understood? He nodded. I folded the envelope and put it in my bag. The call from the agency came that same night, at 8:40, while I was holding my second cup of cold coffee and had a spreadsheet open on the laptop that I already knew wouldn't help me. The receptionist had that trained voice meant to convey calm, the voice of someone who learned not to sound nervous, even when the situation is nervous. "We have an open position for a high-profile client," she said. "Live-in residence. Minimum 3-month contract. Compensation is confidential and only revealed in a face-to-face interview, but I can tell you it's well above the category average." I closed the spreadsheet. "What kind of case?" "Post-trauma rehabilitation. The client is in an intensive recovery phase and needs constant supervision." "And why is the position open?" The pause was too small to be natural. "There was a profile incompatibility with previous professionals." "How many?" Another pause. 15. I should have hung up. Should have thanked her and said I would think about it. Instead, I picked up the pen that was next to the laptop. "Give me the address." The building was in the Loop, in Chicago's financial heart, on one of those corners that makes you understand why some people never need to leave downtown. The lobby was tall, cold, and covered in golden marble, with a reception desk that had no intention of being accessible. The security guard checked my name on a list before letting me through, and my name was already there, which meant they knew I would come before I arrived. The private elevator opened directly into a windowless hallway. Bram Kowalski was waiting for me on the other side, a man around 37 years old, broad-shouldered, with a closed-off face that gave the impression of never having considered another expression. He didn't smile, didn't extend his hand, just looked me up and down with the objectivity of someone doing an assessment, not an introduction. "Neve Calloway," he said, as confirmation, not as a question. "That's me," I replied. He turned and walked. I understood I was supposed to follow. The apartment was enormous, not in the showy way of someone who wants you to notice the size, but in the quiet way of someone who doesn't need to prove anything. The windows covered the entire back wall, and outside Chicago was gray and heavy under a November sky with no promises. I was still processing the space when Bram stopped, turned to me, and spoke. "The monthly salary is $18,000, with all expenses covered and accommodations included. The contract starts." "Yes," I said. He blinked. "I haven't finished the conditions yet." "I know," I breathed. "But the answer is yes." Bram looked at me for a second with that expression of someone who's seen too much to be surprised by anything, and yet was slightly surprised. Then he nodded, walked to the office door at the end of the hallway, and knocked twice before opening it. "Mr. Ferrante will see you now," he said, and gestured for me to enter. I walked through the door and saw, for the first time, the man who would change everything. Chapter 2. The Man in the Chair. The office was large and dark, with wood-paneled walls that absorbed light instead of reflecting it, and a floor-to-ceiling window that occupied the entire back wall. Chicago was out there, gray and heavy, with the November sky pressing down on the buildings like a lid no one had managed to open in weeks. There was a large desk in the center of the space, dark wood, surface too clean to belong to someone who actually worked there, and in front of the window, with his back to me, there was a man in a wheelchair. I stopped at the entrance. Bram had closed the door behind me without making a sound, and the silence in the office was different from the silence in the hallway. It was a silence with weight, with intention, as if the space itself knew I was being evaluated before he even turned around. I stood still, on my feet, without moving toward the chair in front of the desk. If he wanted to test me with silence, I could wait. He took his time. He kept looking at the city below for long enough to make it clear that his time was worth more than mine, and that he wanted me to know that before any words were spoken. Then the chair moved, slowly, and Dorian Ferrante turned to face me. He was 35 years old with the appearance of a man who never needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. His face was elegant and closed off, with a strong jawline and dark eyes that examined me from head to toe with the coldness of a clinical assessment, as if he were the professional in the room and I were the case to be analyzed. He was dressed impeccably for someone in recovery, dark shirt open at the collar, with no concession to the idea of fragility. The wheelchair was there, and he made no effort to ignore it. He simply occupied it the way he occupied everything, with the silent authority of someone who decides what things mean. "Neve Calloway," he said. His voice was deep and controlled, each syllable placed like a piece on a board. "Sit down." It wasn't an invitation. It was an instruction. I sat in the chair in front of the desk and placed my bag on my lap without hurry. "I read your resume," he continued, sliding the chair to the desk with a precise movement. 3 years of nursing, incomplete. 2 years of home care, no long-term references. "Home care contracts tend to be short by nature," I replied, my voice calm. "The patient recovers or the situation changes. It's not a lack of commitment. It's how the work functions." Dorian looked at me for a moment, as if he were weighing the answer to see if there was something underneath it I was hiding. 15 professionals didn't last a week in this position. "I know," the agency informed me. "And yet you're here, and yet I'm here," I confirmed without looking away. He leaned slightly forward, elbows on the desk, fingers interlaced with that calm of someone who has the habit of making people uncomfortable just by the way he occupies space. "What makes you think you'll be different from the other 15? It was a question with teeth, the kind of question that expects you to hesitate, to justify yourself, to try to sell yourself in a way that reveals your insecurity before you realize it. I breathed once and answered with the voice of someone who had thought about the answer before receiving the question. "Because I didn't come here to impress you. I came to work." I opened the notebook I had taken from my bag and kept my eyes on it. "And work doesn't need your approval to be done well. It needs information. What are the current medications and schedules?" The silence that followed lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then, almost imperceptibly, so small I almost doubted having seen it, the right corner of his mouth moved a millimeter. It didn't become a smile, but it was the closest thing to it that, I would discover later, he was capable of showing to someone he had known for less than 5 minutes. He began to answer. I wrote everything down. We were 15 minutes into the conversation, him describing the medication routine with the precision of someone who had memorized every detail out of necessity, me taking notes and interrupting when I needed more specificity. When the office door opened, Bram entered with his usual watchful expression, looked at me, looked at Dorian, and then looked at me again. as if he were trying to understand what had happened in that office, for me to still be sitting there with an open notebook in my hand, and the two of us at peace. "Everything all right, Mr. Ferrante?" he asked, with that neutrality of someone asking a protocol question, but actually checking if intervention was needed. "Yes," Dorian replied, without taking his eyes off me. "You can go, Bram." Bram left. The door closed again, and I understood, in that moment, that Bram's entrance wasn't bureaucracy. It was because the previous 15 had needed some kind of rescue before completing the first hour. The thought almost made me smile. Almost. When we got to the physical care portion, I needed to stand up. Proper planning required that I assess the range of motion in his right shoulder, where there was a secondary injury from the accident, to understand what I could and couldn't do without the physical therapist's support. It was a standard clinical procedure, and I treated it exactly as such. I approached, explained what I was going to do with the objectivity of someone who had done this hundreds of times, and placed my hand on his shoulder. He became completely still, not from pain. I knew the difference between the stillness of someone in pain and the stillness of someone processing something they didn't expect. I asked him to move his arm slowly as far as he could, followed the movement with my hand, felt where the resistance began, and where he was compensating with other muscles to not show the real limit. The distance between us was working distance, functional, necessary, completely professional. But there was something in the air of the office that had changed texture in the last 30 seconds, and I felt it in the same place you feel when the temperature of a room drops before you even notice the cold. I kept my eyes on his shoulder. I wrote down what I needed to write down, and then, as I was preparing to step back, he spoke. "You're not afraid." The observation was made in a low voice, almost to himself, as if it were a piece of data he was recording instead of a sentence directed at me. I paused and looked at him closely, too close for normal conversation. But that's where I was. And stepping back now would look exactly like what I wasn't. Should I be? I asked. Dorian looked at me for a moment with that closed expression I still didn't know how to read completely. There was something in his eyes, not softness. It wasn't that, but something that seemed like recognition, as if he had found an answer to a question he had asked 15 people, and none had answered the right way. He looked away toward the window. "The guest room is at the end of the hallway on the left," he said, his voice back to the controlled tone from before. "Bram will show you." "Right," I said, and put the notebook in my bag. The room was 3 times larger than my entire apartment, with a window that framed Chicago outside as if the city were a work of art placed there on purpose. The bed had the kind of mattress that makes you understand there's a real difference between resting and actually sleeping. Not the price difference, but the physical, sensory difference. The one you feel in your spine when you lie down, and your entire body decides it can let go of the weight it was carrying. I stood at the entrance for a second just to look at all of it, then walked in, placed my bag on the armchair in the corner, and sat on the edge of the bed. $32,000, $18,000 a month, 3 months, and I would have enough to pay off Finn's debt, cover the rent, and still have enough left over to breathe for the first time in 2 years. I needed 60 days without any problems, no unexpected issues, and no reason for Dorian Ferrante to decide I was number 16 on the list. Bram had left on the desk a thin folder with the contract, and underneath the contract, a folded sheet with the apartment's letterhead printed at the top. I opened it. It was a list of rules, small font, compact spacing, numbered from start to finish with a seriousness that suggested each item had been added after some specific incident. I turned the first page, then the second. On the third, I stopped, folded the list carefully, and put it back under the contract. There were 8 pages. I was going to pretend I had read everything. It was a rational decision, and I didn't regret it. I signed the contract, lay down on the most comfortable bed I had ever touched in my life, and closed my eyes. The apartment was silent around me, and outside, Chicago remained gray and cold, with the lights in the buildings beginning to turn on one by one at the end of the afternoon. Somewhere in that hallway, there was a man who had put 15 caregivers through that same door and hadn't given any of them that millimeter at the corner of his mouth. I didn't know what to do with that thought, so I ignored it and slept. I don't know how many hours had passed when the knocking on the door pulled me from sleep. The room was submerged in that bluish, cold darkness that only exists before dawn, when the city hasn't yet decided if it's going to start the day. I sat up in bed with my heart racing for no apparent reason, my eyes still trying to find the space around me, and said, "Yes, Ms. Calloway." The voice on the other side was Bram's, as neutral at 5 in the morning as it had been at 3 in the afternoon. "Mr. Ferrante needs you." Chapter 3. Closer Than I Should Be. It was 5:20 in the morning when I walked into the hallway with my hair still messy and my eyes trying to adjust to the low light of the apartment. Bram was standing outside Dorian's room with the posture of someone who had been awake for hours, which, I would soon discover, was his natural state. He looked at me, gestured toward the door, and said only, "The morning protocol starts now." I nodded, took a deep breath, and went in. Dorian's room was dark and quiet, with a single lamp lit in the corner projecting a low amber light over the space. He was sitting in the wheelchair beside the bed, already awake, with the upright posture of someone who had decided long ago that refusing to look tired was a form of control. His shirt was draped over the back of the chair, still folded. He didn't look at me when I entered. He looked at the window, where Chicago was completely dark outside, as if the entire city was still sleeping while the two of us were there. "Good morning," I said, my voice calm like someone at work. "It's too early for judgments of any kind," he replied, without taking his eyes off the window. I almost smiled. I kept that to myself and went to check the morning medications, which were organized on the nightstand on a small tray, 6 bottles lined up with a precision that clearly wasn't accidental. I checked each one against the protocol I had written down the previous afternoon, separated the right doses, and brought a glass of water. Dorian took the pills without comment, without thanking me, without looking at me. I collected the glass and said, with the objectivity of someone describing a procedure, "The shower comes next. The bathroom is accessible through the door on the left. I'll need you to tell me when you're ready to transfer to the bench." There was a pause. Not long, just the kind of pause that happens when a person is deciding how to react to something. Then he turned and looked at me for the first time since I had entered the room. With that closed expression I was already beginning to recognize as the face he used when he was assessing the ground before moving. "The previous 15 quit at this stage," he said, his voice neutral like someone passing along factual information. "I know," I replied, with the same neutrality. "I'm here." Dorian's bathroom was covered in black marble from floor to ceiling, with a spacious shower that had been adapted with a built-in bench and side support bars, adaptations made after the accident, I deduced, because the rest of the space had that aesthetic of someone who doesn't give up anything for practical reasons. The light fixture above the mirror projected a cold white light that forgave nothing, and there was a silence in there that was different from the silence in the bedroom, more enclosed, more immediate. I had done this before, not in the same way, not in that environment, not with that patient, but I had cared for someone who could no longer do the things they had done their entire life, and I knew what that weighed. I knew what it was like to be on the other side. That's why I didn't treat that moment as something delicate or loaded with meaning. I treated it as what it was, a necessary procedure that needed to be done efficiently and with respect, and nothing more. I helped Dorian transfer from the chair to the shower bench with the correct support. One hand on his arm, the weight distributed at the right angle to not overload the shoulder with the secondary injury. He moved with the stiffness of someone who hated every second of this, and was determined not to show how much. When he was seated on the bench, I turned to the shower valve and began adjusting the water temperature. "You're ignoring me on purpose," he said behind me. "I'm adjusting the water temperature," I replied without turning around. "It's the same thing." I tested the water with my wrist, adjusted it 2 degrees to the left, and turned to him with the expression of someone explaining something to a child who insists on complicating the simple. "Mr. Ferrante, I've seen everything there is to see. You can relax." He looked at me. There was something in that expression, not anger, not embarrassment, something more like the discomfort of someone who doesn't know where to put their hands when the script they had prepared didn't work. Dorian Ferrante was a man who knew exactly the effect he produced in any room he entered, and I had spent the last 4 minutes treating the entire situation with the same solemnity with which one changes a bandage. He didn't say anything else. I took care of what needed to be taken care of efficiently and without ceremony, and when I finished, I helped with the transfer back to the chair with the same technical support as before. Dorian remained quiet throughout, not the quiet of someone who's angry, but the quiet of someone processing something they hadn't planned to process. Only when I was already collecting the towels from the bench did he speak, his voice low, and with the tone of someone thinking out loud, without having decided to do so. "The others ran out at this part." "I know," I said, for the second time that morning. "Must have been very convenient for you." There was silence. Then, from somewhere behind me, came a sound I didn't expect. Short, contained, almost nothing. It wasn't exactly a laugh. It was the sound a laugh makes when someone decides to stifle it at the last second. I didn't turn to see, but I felt it as if I had turned. Dr. Hadley Vance arrived at 8 o'clock sharp, as Bram had informed me the day before. He was a man of about 40, medium height with precise gestures, with that kind of functional and efficient presence that good physical therapists develop over time. The presence of someone who's there to do the work, not to be noticed. He greeted Dorian with the familiarity of someone who had done this many times, greeted me with professional courtesy, and began the session without delay. My role during the exercises was support. Position the limb when Dr. Vance needed a second hand, hold the weight when the position required balance, observe the angles so I could replicate the correct movements in sessions when the physical therapist wasn't present. I did all of this attentively, memorizing each instruction, each posture correction, each point where Dorian resisted more than he should, and needed to be guided to yield. And it was during one of these moments, when Dr. Vance had to step away to get an elastic band, and I took over the support alone, with my hand positioned under Dorian's ankle to maintain the correct angle during the stretch, that I noticed he was looking at me. It wasn't the clinical look from the interview, It wasn't the assessment look. It was a different look, quieter, like the look of someone trying to understand something they can't name. I kept my eyes on the ankle positioning and pretended not to have seen. "Press here," I said, indicating the exact point with my thumb. "Only as far as it doesn't hurt. You know the difference," he said slowly. "What difference? Between the way he touches and the way you touch?" I looked at him then, because the observation had caught me by surprise, not because of what it said, but because of the tone in which it was said. It wasn't a provocation, it was a statement, and there was something in it that sounded almost like a question he hadn't finished formulating. "I learned by taking care of someone," I said, and returned my eyes to the ankle. Dorian was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was lower than before, with that quality of someone moving a piece slowly to see what happens on the other side of the board. "Who?" Dr. Vance came back with the elastic band before I needed to answer. I stood up, handed the support over to him, and positioned myself on the other side without saying anything. But I felt Dorian's gaze on the side of my face for the rest of the session, controlled, patient, waiting. Finn's message arrived at 10:30, while I was organizing the morning records at the kitchen table. It was short, without punctuation, the way Finn wrote when he was trying to minimize something that wasn't small. A car passed in front of the building twice just so I could see. I read the message twice. Then I placed the phone face down on the table, breathed slowly through my nose, and counted to 5 in my head, a habit I had developed in recent months, when anger and fear started showing up at the same time, and I needed to separate them before reacting. Then I picked up the phone again, typed "Stay home, don't open the door for anyone," and put the device in my uniform pocket. When I raised my eyes, Dorian was in the kitchen entrance. He had moved there on his own, something I had noticed he did more and more frequently, small crossings through the apartment that were, at the same time, exercise and refusal to need to ask for help to move within his own space. He was looking at me with that usual closed expression, but there was something different in it now, a sharper attention, more direct, as if he had seen what I had hidden before I could hide it properly. "Any problems?" he asked. "None," I said, and smiled. Dorian looked at me for a moment too long to be casual, the kind of look that says the person on the other side didn't believe anything you just said, but we'll save it for later. Then he looked away toward the kitchen window, where Chicago was covered by that cold November fog that wasn't rain, but also wasn't anything good. I collected the papers from the table and stood up to leave the kitchen. I was already at the door when his voice came from behind, low and direct, as if the question had been waiting for the right moment since 8 in the morning. "Who were you taking care of before?" I stopped, didn't turn around. The papers were in my hand, and the hallway was in front of me, and the answer was in my throat before I even decided whether to give it. "My mother," I said, and I left. Chapter 4. What He's Hiding. 3 weeks inside that apartment, and I already knew every sound he made. I knew the sound of the private elevator arriving at the floor, a dry metallic click, followed by 2 seconds of silence before the doors opened. I knew Bram's footsteps in the hallway, heavy, regular, without variation, like a human metronome that never went off rhythm. I knew the hours when Dorian's office stayed with the door closed, which meant there was someone in there I shouldn't see, and the hours when it stayed open, which meant he was working alone, and it was safe to move through the apartment without calculating every movement. In the first few days, I had treated that environment like a private hospital. Go in, do what needed to be done, leave. But 3 weeks create a familiarity that no professional protocol can completely prevent. I knew that Dorian took his coffee without sugar and without comment. I knew that he read printed reports instead of screens, and that the pages stayed stacked on the office desk in reverse order from how they had arrived. The most recent on the bottom, the oldest on top, as if he needed to reconstruct the reasoning from the beginning before moving forward. I knew that on days when the pain in his hip was worse, he became quieter than usual, not more aggressive, and that this silence was the most honest signal he gave about how he was feeling. I stored all this information with the objectivity of someone assembling a clinical file. That's what I told myself. On a Tuesday afternoon, Bram appeared at the door of the room where I was organizing the weekly records, and said, with his usual economy of words, "Dr. Vance isn't coming today. Personal crisis." He communicated that the session will need to be covered internally. I closed the folder. "Right. I'll do it." Bram looked at me for a second, not with doubt, but with that silent attention of someone who registers everything, and then nodded and left. I went to Dorian's room. He was by the window when I entered, his gaze fixed on the city outside and his jaw slightly set, which I had learned to identify as the sign that pain was present, and that he had decided to ignore it on principle. When he saw me with the exercise notebook in my hand, the expression didn't change, but his right shoulder rose 2 millimeters, an involuntary tension, small enough that anyone else wouldn't notice. "Dr. Vance isn't coming," I said. "I know." Then let's start. I pulled the chair to the center of the room, in the open space we used for sessions, and gestured. Come on. Dorian looked at me with that expression of someone weighing how many objections he can raise before realizing he won't win any of them. Then he moved toward the chair. The first 10 minutes were an undeclared negotiation between my patience and his resistance. Every repetition I asked for, he did halfway, not because of inability, but because of that specific stubbornness of men who interpret effort as vulnerability. When I corrected the angle of his knee, he let it slide back to the wrong position right after. When I asked for full extension of the leg, he stopped 2/3 of the way with the expression of someone who considers that sufficient. I counted the repetitions with the forced patience of someone who's worked in a daycare and survived to tell the story. 1, 2, 3, 4, I said, following the movement with my hand positioned under his knee. That one doesn't count. You bent your leg too soon. Dorian stopped and looked at me. It was the look of a man who runs a criminal organization and isn't used to hearing that something he did doesn't count. The expression had layers. One part was genuine irritation. Another part was something I couldn't name precisely, but that vaguely resembled the desire to argue just to hear me argue back. I bent it 2 centimeters, he said. 2 centimeters matter. I repositioned my hand. 4, again. He held the look for another second. Then he did the movement, correctly this time. 5, I said. 6, 7, 8, 9. That one doesn't count either. You held your breath. Neve. 10. Breathe. And again from 1. There was a low sound coming from Dorian that wasn't exactly a word and wasn't exactly a curse, but sat comfortably in the middle ground between the two. I decided not to hear it and kept counting. We were on the 3rd set of exercises when I needed to check his spine alignment. It was a standard stage of the session. Dr. Vance did this every time, and I had observed the procedure enough to replicate it accurately. I positioned myself beside Dorian, placed one hand flat on his lower ribs to feel his breathing, and leaned in to check if his shoulders were at the correct angle. And then I realized our faces were too close. It hadn't been intentional. It was simply the geometry of the procedure, the distance the work required. But there was a difference between knowing that rationally and feeling the heat of his body less than 8 inches from my face, and noticing that his breathing had changed rhythm under my hand. I kept my eyes on his shoulders. Mentally, I went through each stage of the procedure in order, like a task list with checkboxes. Right shoulder, slightly anterior. Left shoulder, aligned. Dorian didn't move. Neither did I. The silence lasted 1 second longer than it should have. It was the kind of silence that isn't absence of noise. It's presence of something that neither of us had named yet, and that was occupying the space between us with an almost physical consistency. I was about to straighten up when he spoke, his voice low and too close for that space. Neve. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an instruction. It was just my name, said that way, and there was something in that tone that made my stomach tighten in a way I wasn't prepared to handle. 3 knocks on the door. Firm, spaced, unmistakable. Mr. Ferrante. Bram's voice came from the hallway, completely oblivious to anything that had happened in the last 30 seconds. The 3 o'clock call. I straightened up. Dorian looked away toward the wall in front of him. The space between us returned to being the working space it had been from the beginning, functional and professional, as if the last fraction of a minute had been a temporary change in atmospheric pressure that the environment had corrected on its own. Come in, Dorian said, his voice completely controlled. Bram opened the door and entered with his phone in hand, without looking at me or him in any way that suggested he had arrived at any specific moment. I collected the exercise notebook from the chair, noted the session records in regular handwriting, and left without hurry. In the hallway, I breathed. The unknown number appeared on my phone screen at 4:30 in the afternoon while I was in the hallway connecting the service wing to the kitchen. I answered because unknown numbers, in recent months, had become a category I couldn't ignore. Ms. Calloway. The voice was male, calm with that specific calmness of someone who doesn't need to raise their voice to threaten. The current month's interest has been added to your brother's balance. The current total is $36,400. Mr. Morrow expects an initial payment by the end of this week. I listened to everything without interrupting. When the voice finished, I said, understood, and hung up. Then I went to the service bathroom, turned the cold water on full blast, put my wrists under the water, and breathed slowly, counting the seconds. The water was cold enough to hold my attention, which was the point. $36,400. The debt had grown by $4,400 in 3 weeks. With the interest Silas Morrow charged, in another month it would be $42,000. In 2 months, it would be a number I couldn't cover even with the entire contract salary. I turned off the water, dried my wrists, picked up my phone. Petra Lundy answered on the second ring, as she always did when it was me calling, a Pavlovian reflex developed over 6 years of friendship and various crises. Talk to me, she said, and I could hear the noise of the cafe in the background, the customers' voices, the espresso machine. I need 2 minutes, I whispered, with the bathroom door closed behind me. Neve, you're whispering. Why are you whispering? Because I'm in the client's apartment. The mobster client? Petra. Okay. Okay, 2 minutes. Talk. I told her everything in a quick, compressed whisper. The call, the interest, the new total, the weekend deadline. Petra listened in silence long enough for me to realize she was processing instead of reacting, which, coming from Petra, meant the situation was serious enough to suspend her filter for a few seconds. Those seconds ended. Naive. Her voice had that specific intonation of when she was about to say something I didn't want to hear, but that she was going to say anyway because she was Petra, and she was physically incapable of keeping an opinion to herself. You're living in a mobster's penthouse. You're being paid a fortune per month. And the biggest concern is still Finn's debt. A very short pause. Neve, I know how it sounds. You know how it sounds, and you're still calling me to tell me about it like it's a normal Thursday afternoon problem. What should I do? I don't know, but you clearly have resources available now that you didn't have before. She lowered her voice, which with Petra meant she was being truly serious. Take care of yourself first. Finn is an adult. I didn't respond to that. I said I needed to get back, that we'd talk later, and hung up with the feeling of someone who received completely logical advice that they can't apply because the problem isn't logical. It's Finn, and Finn had never been a logical problem. When I left the hallway and crossed back to the main room, Dorian was near the window. He had finished the 3 o'clock call and had a report open on his lap. But he wasn't reading. He was watching me cross the space with those dark, attentive eyes that missed nothing. I smiled. The kind of smile I had learned to use when I needed my face to say one thing, while the rest of me said another. Dorian didn't say anything, but his eyes stayed in my direction for 1 second longer than necessary for someone who was just watching me pass. That night, after I had retreated to my room, and the apartment had gone quiet, Dorian was in the office with Bram on the other side of the desk. The door was closed. The conversation was brief. The caregiver, Dorian said without preamble. Find out what's going on with her. Bram didn't ask why. He just nodded and left. Chapter 5. When Everything Falls Apart. Dorian read Bram's report on Thursday morning, with the office door closed and the city outside covered by that flat white November light that warmed nothing. I wasn't in the room when he read it, but Bram told me later, not in words, because Bram rarely used words when a gesture was enough, just with the look he gave me when he left the office that morning, a look that said something had changed, and that I should stay alert. I didn't understand the warning in time. The video arrived on my phone at 2:17 in the afternoon, while I was walking through the hallway connecting the main room to the service wing. It was a number I didn't know. I opened it, because numbers I didn't know, in the context of recent months, were things I couldn't put off. Finn was sitting in a wooden chair, in a room I didn't recognize, concrete walls without windows, a bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. His hands were tied behind the backrest and there was a small cut on his right eyebrow, dry, that had stopped bleeding but was recent enough for me to know it had happened that day. 2 men were standing in the background, backs to the camera, with broad shoulders, and the postures of people who had been placed there to be seen. Finn looked directly at the camera with wide eyes, his mouth slightly open, and said nothing. He didn't need to. The message was all there, in the 11 seconds of video that ended with an abrupt cut. I watched it twice. Then I put the phone in my uniform pocket and stood in the hallway for a few seconds, my back against the wall and my lungs working harder than they should for a person standing still in a hallway. Finn was 21 years old. He had slept with the light on until he was 12 because he was afraid of the dark, and I had never told anyone because it was the kind of thing a younger brother doesn't forgive. He had learned to make grilled cheese at 11, after our mother got sick for the first time, and for a period of 6 months that had been dinner every Monday because it was all he knew how to make. I had fought with him more times than I could count in the last 2 years, and had lost my patience with him even more times, and had said things I didn't want to have said, because exhaustion has a way of speaking for you before you decide. But it was Finn. And Finn was in a chair with his hands tied, and a cut on his eyebrow, and I was in a hallway of an apartment in the Loop, with my phone in my pocket, and $36,000 in debt, and absolutely no option that would solve this in real time. I was putting my phone back in my pocket when I heard the sound of the wheelchair in the hallway. Dorian appeared around the corner of the hallway with the speed of someone moving with purpose. One of those crossings he made alone through the apartment, which I had learned not to intercept, because he needed to do them the same way he needed to take his medications. As proof, he still had control over something. He saw me before I had time to recompose my expression. He stopped. I know how I must have looked in that moment. My eyes weren't crying, but they had that specific dilation of someone holding something too heavy. My shoulders were rigid. The phone was in my hand instead of in my pocket, which meant I had taken it back out without realizing. What happened? He asked. His voice was completely flat, without inflection, without curiosity. It was the voice I had learned to recognize as the voice of when he had already made an assessment and was just confirming what he knew. I could have said it was nothing, could have smiled with that smile that had worked the week before, but there was an 11-second video on my phone with Finn tied to a chair, and the weight of it no longer fit inside the space I had opened to store it. I told him. Not in order, not calmly. I told him the way things come out when you've held them too long. The debt, the months of escalating threats, the message about the car passing in front of the building, the phone call with the interest, the video that had arrived less than 5 minutes ago. I didn't cry while I spoke. I stood in the hallway with my back still against the wall and said everything with the firm voice of someone who learned that crying in front of people you don't know well enough is a way of losing the ground you still have. Dorian listened in total silence. Not a word, not a gesture, not a change of expression that told me what he was thinking. When I finished, he was quiet for 2 or 3 seconds. Not the quiet of someone processing, but the quiet of someone who had already processed and was deciding the next action. The loan shark's name, he said. Silas Morrow. Something passed across his face. It lasted less than a second and disappeared before I could identify what it was. He looked at the hallway to his left. Bram appeared in the office entrance as if he had been waiting to be called, which, I suspected, was literally what had happened. Silas Morrow, Dorian said. Just that. Now. Bram nodded and left. In less than 4 hours, Finn was free. I knew because Finn called me at 6:42 in the afternoon, his voice shaky in the background of the call with the noise of a street I didn't recognize. He said he was okay, that there were 2 men with him who had said they were friends of mine, and that they were going to take him to a safe place until I could pick him up. I said it was fine, that he could trust them, that I would call as soon as I knew more. I hung up. Then I stood in the middle of the kitchen, phone in hand, and the silence of the apartment around me, and tried to understand what had just happened. In less than 4 hours, without negotiation, without waiting, without any of the processes I had spent the last months trying to imagine how to navigate. Silas Morrow had received a visit from 2 men from the Ferrante family, who, as Bram would explain to me later with the neutrality of someone describing a weather report, had left a very clear message. Finn Calloway's debt had been redirected, and there would be no further contact of any nature with any member of the Calloway family, under any circumstances. I tried to calculate the cost of that, not the financial cost, the cost of exposure, what it meant for a man in Dorian's position to intervene in a situation involving a rival loan shark, how much it had complicated a dynamic that was already delicate. He didn't need to have done this. I was an employee with 3 weeks on contract. I was nobody to him. That thought was what undid me. It wasn't the relief, although the relief was real and immense, and I felt it in my shoulders, which finally dropped after weeks of being locked up. It wasn't the exhaustion, although the exhaustion was there too, accumulated in layers I had forgotten existed. It was that specific thought. I was nobody to him, and he did this anyway, that opened something I had kept closed with great discipline for a long time. I cried there, standing in the middle of the kitchen, without making noise, my back curved slightly inward, as if my body were trying to contain something that no longer fit. It wasn't crying from sadness. It was the crying of someone who carried too much weight for too long, and who, at a specific and unexpected moment, simply has nowhere left to store it. I heard the wheelchair approaching before I raised my eyes. Dorian had entered the kitchen and was standing a meter away from me, looking at me with that closed expression I knew well enough to know he didn't know what to do. It wasn't indifference. It was the opposite of that, actually. It was the face of a man who spent his entire life in a world where emotion is vulnerability, and vulnerability is risk, and who in that moment was looking at something that had no established protocol to manage. He didn't say anything, didn't try to fix it, didn't try to explain what he had done or minimize it or turn it into a transaction with terms and conditions. He just stayed there for a moment, and then moved the chair a little closer in my direction, extended his hand, and placed it over mine. Just that, his hand over mine, large and firm and completely still, like a real weight in the right place at the right time. I didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. The apartment fell silent around the 2 of us, while Chicago cooled outside, and the kitchen light projected our shadows on the wall with a clarity that seemed excessive for that moment. It was the first touch that had nothing clinical about it, and it changed something I couldn't name at that moment. I just knew it had changed, the same way you know when the weight of something shifts from one hand to another without anyone announcing it. Taddeo Ferrante arrived at 7 in the evening, with a bag of fruit in one hand and an easy, familiar smile on his face. He was 32 years old, slightly less imposing than Dorian and slightly more accessible, the kind of man who enters a room and makes sure everyone feels comfortable, which, in that world, was a specific skill that didn't come without purpose. He was Dorian's cousin and potential heir to the family leadership, according to what I had deduced from fragmented conversations between Bram and other men who passed through the apartment. He greeted Dorian with the familiarity of someone who grew up at the same table, asked about the recovery with interest that seemed genuine, and made a kind comment about the progress Bram had mentioned. Then he turned to me with the same easy smile and said, "Neve, right? Dorian spoke well of your work." "Good to hear," I said, with standard professional courtesy. He stayed 20 minutes, asked about the physical therapy routine, ate 2 grapes from the bag he had brought, and left with the lightness of someone who had nothing weighing on him. The door closed behind him. Nothing about that man caught my attention. It was almost 2 a.m. when I gave up on sleeping. I had tried for more than an hour, lying in the dark ceiling of the room, with the silence of the apartment around me and my mind refusing to slow down. I thought about the video of Finn, about Dorian's hand over mine, about the 11 seconds of concrete and bare bulb that I would probably carry for longer than I wanted. Then I got up, put my hoodie over my pajamas, and went out to the living room. Dorian was there. He was standing by the panoramic window, looking at Chicago below with the entire city lit and quiet at this hour, the skyscrapers reflecting a low, cold light rising from the wet asphalt. He didn't turn when I entered. I didn't ask why he was awake. He didn't ask why I was. I approached the window and stood beside him. Chicago was out there in silence, with the lights of the buildings blinking slowly and the cold wind rising from the lake, and between us, there was only that shared silence that didn't need any words to be something. We stayed like that for a long time, the two of us, the window, the city. Chapter 6, The Crack in the Ice. In the days following the silent night in front of the window, something in the apartment changed texture. It wasn't a change I could point to in a specific scene or exact moment. It was the sum of small things that, isolated, meant nothing, but together created a different atmosphere from what had existed in the previous 3 weeks. Dorian had stopped testing. Not overnight, not in any announced way, simply, gradually, the surgical questions and cutting comments were being replaced by silences that no longer had the intention of making me feel like I was invading a space that wasn't mine. He was still cold, still controlled, but there was a difference between the cold of someone building a barrier and the cold of someone simply made of that material, and I had learned to distinguish between the two. I was careful. I knew exactly what that change meant and what it couldn't mean, and I carried that knowledge with the discipline of someone who knows that one step out of place undoes everything that's been built. I was the caregiver. He was the client. The contract had a defined duration, and I had a debt that had been redirected, not canceled, and a 21-year-old brother who still needed someone to keep their head in place. I knew all of this. And even so, on Thursday night, when Bram left for an external meeting and the apartment fell silent around me, I went to the kitchen and started cooking. It wasn't part of my duties. The apartment had a delivery service that stocked the fridge 3 times a week with prepared meals, and there was a laminated list on the pantry door, with items that could be used and those that couldn't. I had respected that list for weeks. But there were ripe tomatoes on the middle shelf and fresh basil in the corner of the sink. And it was Thursday night, and the apartment was too quiet. And sometimes cooking is the only thing that makes the noise inside your head slow down to a manageable volume. I was sautéing garlic in the pan when I heard the wheelchair at the kitchen entrance. I didn't turn immediately. I finished what I was doing, stirred the garlic, adjusted the heat, put the chopped tomatoes in the pan, and only then looked over my shoulder. Dorian was standing at the entrance, with the expression of someone who had arrived with one intention and found something else in its place. He looked at the pan, then at me, then at the pan again. "You want dinner?" I said, turning my eyes back to the stove. "Or did you just come to watch me?" There was a 2-second pause. "Both, apparently," he replied. I felt the heat rise slightly in my face and attributed it to the steam from the pan, which was a perfectly reasonable explanation. We ate at the kitchen table, which was smaller and less formal than the dining room table, and which, for that reason, I had chosen without thinking much about it. Only after serving both plates did I realize I had made a choice, and that the choice had implications, and that it was too late to undo it, without that seeming like a bigger thing than it was. Dorian didn't complain about the table or the plate. He ate in silence for a few minutes, with that contained way of someone who evaluates before commenting, and when he spoke it was only to say, "You cook like someone who had to learn fast." I considered the observation. My mother got sick when I was 17. Someone had to. He didn't respond to that immediately. There was a different quality in his silence that night, less calculated, more present, as if he were really there instead of managing the space around him. I ate, and he ate, and the kitchen was quiet with the kind of quietness that isn't uncomfortable. He was the one who spoke first, his voice low and with the tone of someone placing something on the table carefully, as if the weight of it needed to be distributed slowly to not break the surface. My brother was 22 when he died. I stopped, didn't interrupt him, didn't move my fork, didn't make any gesture that might close the space he had opened. "Layor," he continued, looking at his plate. 3 years younger than me. A short pause, so compressed it seemed more like a breath than silence. I sent him on that mission. There were other options. things. I chose him because he was the fastest, and because I trusted him more than any other man I had. His fingers moved slightly on the table, a small, involuntary gesture that he interrupted before completing. He didn't come back. I didn't say it was a shame, didn't say it wasn't his fault, didn't say any of the things people say when they don't know what to say and need to fill the silence with something that seems useful. I just stayed there, eyes on him, and let what he had said occupy the space it deserved without trying to shrink it or fix it. Dorian looked at me then, a quick look, almost cautious, like the look of someone who said more than they planned and is checking what happened with it. I kept my gaze open and quiet, without pity and without discomfort, and something in his face changed so subtly I almost didn't see it. A muscle in his jaw loosened a millimeter, as if a tension that had been there too long had found for a moment a place where it didn't need to exist. He looked away back to his plate. 6 years, he said, more to himself than to me, and it's still the first thing I think about when I wake up. I didn't respond. There was an answer I could give, about my mother, about what it's like to carry the weight of something that can't be undone, but that wasn't the moment for my things. It was the moment for his. So I stayed quiet and let him have that without it needing to be turned into an exchange. After dinner, I collected the plates. Dorian was still at the table, with his glass of water in hand, and his gaze loose on some point in the kitchen that wasn't exactly anything. The gaze of someone who's still somewhere they visited recently and hasn't completely returned. I washed the dishes without hurry, left the utensils in the drainer, and started to collect the pan from the counter. When I passed by the table to put the pan in the cabinet on the opposite side, I passed too close. It wasn't a decision. It was the geometry of the space, the position of his chair in relation to the natural path between the counter and the cabinet. But when I passed within a hand's width of the chair, his hand came out and closed lightly around my wrist. I stopped. It wasn't a grab. It was just a hand wrapping around the wrist with a firm and quiet pressure, like someone holding something that was passing before it disappeared. I looked down, at his hand on my wrist, and then looked at him. Dorian was looking up at me with that closed expression I had learned to read in layers, and the top layer, the layer of control, of assessment, of calculation, was there, but there was something underneath it that was coming to the surface with a slowness that seemed to cost some effort. His eyes were dark and completely fixed on mine, and the distance between us was too small to be neutral. The pan was in my hand. His hand was on my wrist. Neither of us moved. He tilted his head slightly, a centimeter, maybe less, and I felt his breathing change rhythm, slower and deeper, like the breathing of someone about to say something they didn't plan to say. The space between us was getting smaller, without either of us having really moved, and there was something in the kitchen air that was no longer the smell of garlic and basil, but was equally hard to ignore. The apartment door opened. The sound of Bram's keys in the lock was clear and immediate in the hallway silence, followed by the sound of his footsteps crossing the hall, and then entering the kitchen with a folder under his arm, and the expression of someone who had just arrived from a productive meeting and was ready to report the results. "Mr. Ferrante," Bram said, with total naturalness, stopping at the kitchen entrance with the folder already open in his hand. "The meeting is concluded. Kowalski confirmed the transfer of collateral to the South Depot. Do you want the report now, or would you prefer it in the morning?" Dorian had released my wrist in the exact second the door had opened. I had taken a step toward the cabinet with the pan in my hand, and now had my back to both of them, putting the pan on the shelf with the careful movements of someone paying attention to something that needs no attention at all. "In the morning," Dorian said, and his voice was completely controlled. Bram nodded and left. The silence that remained was different from the silence before. It was the silence of after, which carries the weight of what was there and now wasn't anymore. I closed the cabinet door and stood still for a second with my hand still on the wood. Then, from somewhere I hadn't planned and couldn't stop, came a laugh. Small, short, completely involuntary, the kind of laugh born from an absurdity too good to be contained. I heard behind me the sound of Dorian closing his eyes. I didn't see him do it, but I know that's what happened. Later that night, I had already retreated to my room and was lying in bed with the book open on my chest and my eyes on the ceiling when I heard Dorian's phone ring in the office. It wasn't uncommon. Calls came at irregular hours, and I had learned not to pay attention to it. But there was something about the way the apartment went quiet after the call was answered, a thicker silence than usual, the quality of silence when a conversation is happening in a very low voice behind a closed door, that kept me awake without me knowing exactly why. The conversation lasted 15 minutes. I know because I looked at the clock when it started, and looked again when the office door opened. Dorian crossed the hallway toward his room with the expression I had seen only once before. Not anger, not worry, but that specific and contained expression of when something entered the board and needs to be evaluated before any move is made. He passed by my bedroom door without looking inside, but 1 second before turning the corner of the hallway, his eyes met mine through the crack of the half-open door. It lasted less than a second. Then he was gone, and the hallway was quiet, and I lay in bed with the book closed on my chest, and the certainty that didn't need any words to form. The subject of that call was me. Chapter 7. Stay or Run. Aurelio Mancini arrived Friday morning at 10 o'clock sharp, and I knew that visit wasn't social before he even took off his coat. He was 68 years old and carried every one of them in his posture, not as weight, but as accumulated authority, like someone who had spent decades being the smartest man in any room he entered. He was the consigliere of the Ferrante family, counselor for 30 years, first to Dorian's father, and then to Dorian himself, the figure who guarded the family's traditions with the rigidity of an archivist who knows that certain documents cannot be replaced. There was in his eyes a specific coldness of someone who makes difficult decisions with ease because he learned long ago not to let any feeling interfere with logic. He greeted me in the hallway with a courtesy that was technically polite and emotionally null. Then Bram led him to the office. The door closed, and I went to the living room with the morning records and the very clear awareness that the subject of that meeting was me. The walls of that apartment had an acoustic quality that the architect probably hadn't considered a problem. I was sitting with the records on the low table when the voices started arriving in complete sentences, especially when the tone rose, and Aurelio Mancini's tone rose with the regularity of someone presenting an argument he considers irrefutable. A civilian caregiver in the family boss's apartment is a vulnerability. His voice was deep and precise, each word placed with the force of someone building a case. She hears too much. She knows too much. And more than that, a calibrated pause. The way you look at her is a problem. Emotion is weakness, and weakness kills bosses. I placed the records on the table and stood still, listening. Tadeo shares this concern. Aurelio's voice had lowered, which paradoxically made it heavier. The family is watching. The proposal is simple. Full payment of the remaining contract, confidentiality agreement, and Miss Calloway resumes the life she had before. It's a clean exit for everyone involved. The silence from inside the office lasted a few seconds. Then Dorian's voice came, completely flat. No, just that. One word, without explanation, without negotiation. And there was in that no the quality of a final decision, not the no of someone opening space for counter-arguments, but the no of someone who has already closed the matter internally and is just communicating the result. Aurelio spoke for a few more minutes with a more contained tone, recalculating. Then I heard the sound of a chair being pushed back, and his footsteps crossing the office. I stood up. When the office door opened and Aurelio came out into the hallway, I was already standing in the middle of the room with my bag in hand, not completely packed, but in the way of someone who went to their room, grabbed the most important things in a reflex, and came back before thinking too much. Aurelio looked at me as he passed with a brief, evaluative look, without surprise. Then he left, and the hallway was quiet. Dorian came out of the office 30 seconds later. He saw me with the bag in my hand and stopped. His eyes went from the bag to my face, and I saw the exact moment he understood what he was seeing, not with surprise, but with the expression of someone who had predicted the scene, and still didn't like finding it. I spoke first. I heard enough, I said, my voice firm, without accusation. I can pack my bags. It'll take an hour. I didn't ask you to pack anything, he said, but your counselor doesn't work for me. A 1-second pause, and then, with his voice still flat, but with a precision that made each word heavier than its size, I work for no one. I stood still with the bag in my hand, looking for some ambiguity in that sentence that would give me an out. I didn't find any. It was exactly what it was. A direct declaration of the type Dorian clearly only made when he had decided the cost of not making it was greater than the cost of making it. I lowered the bag. The silence that remained between us was different from all the previous ones. It was the silence after a choice, and choices change the texture of everything around them. Right, I said. Right, he repeated. No celebration, no speech. Just two adults in an apartment in Chicago who had chosen something without yet naming what it was. Dr. Vance's weekly report was on the living room table when I passed by there at 8:30 that night. Dorian was beside the window with the document in his hands. I approached to collect the empty cup from the table and ended up stopping beside him, close enough for the words of the report to be in my field of vision. The progress was significant. Dr. Vance wrote with the contained language of doctors who learned not to generate expectations beyond what the data supports, but there was enthusiasm between the lines, in the sentence structure, in the choice of adjectives, in the passage underlined by hand about the muscular response in recent sessions. With intense and consistent effort in the following 2 weeks, there was a real possibility of attempting the first steps with support. I read that and felt something tighten in my chest, that emotion without a precise name that appears when you realize that someone who was at the bottom is, slowly, and at great cost, finding their way back. It's going to be horrible, I said without thinking. Dorian lowered the report slightly and looked at me with something close to humor in that expression. Contained, dry, almost invisible. Thanks for the encouragement, he said. It's not lack of encouragement. I looked at the underlined passage. It's just that I'll be at your side demanding every centimeter, and you already know how I count repetitions. The right corner of his mouth moved, the same millimeter as always. That small and rare gesture I had learned to recognize as his version of something much bigger. Then he looked back at the report, and the profile of his face against the Chicago window had that familiar hardness that I had discovered in recent weeks, was just the top layer. "Will you be here?" he asked, his voice low, looking at the paper. It wasn't a question about the next 14 days. We both knew that. I looked at him for a moment. His profile, the window, the city outside with the first lights of evening reflecting on the wet asphalt, and then said, with the calm voice of someone who already knows the answer longer than they admitted to themselves, "Yes." Chapter 8. The Impossible Step. The snow came to Chicago in early December, earlier than expected, and covered the city overnight with that specific silence snow makes when it falls without wind, a silence different from all others, thicker, as if the world had decided to pause to check something before continuing. I was still sleeping when the light changed in the room. I woke up without knowing why, with that soft disorientation of someone pulled from sleep by something that wasn't noise, and then I saw the white through the window and understood. I got up, put on my hoodie, and went to the living room. Dorian was by the panoramic window, facing Chicago, with the entire city covered in white below, and the leaden sky weighing on the rooftops. He wasn't looking at the city with his usual gaze, the gaze of someone managing a territory. He was looking differently, quieter, like someone simply seeing something beautiful without needing to do anything with it. He didn't turn when I entered. He stayed another moment looking out and then said, his voice low and without ceremony, "Snow." I stopped in the middle of the room. He was still with his back to me, but there was a tone in that word that wasn't a call. It was an observation, almost to himself, as if he were naming something he had noticed. I followed his gaze to the window, to the snow covering Chicago outside, and said nothing, but something small and warm settled in my chest, and stayed. That day's physical therapy session was scheduled for 10 in the morning, and Dr. Vance arrived with his usual punctuality, but there was something different about him that morning. Extra care in his movements, more concentrated attention on his face when examining the week's records. I noticed before he said anything. "Today we try," he said, looking at Dorian. Dorian didn't respond immediately. There was a quality in his silence that I had learned to recognize as the silence of someone who has already decided, but who needs a second to let the decision settle before acting on it. Then he nodded, with that short, single gesture that was his version of total agreement. I positioned myself on his left side, with my hand ready at the angle Dr. Vance had taught me, not holding, just present. An available support point. The physical therapist stayed on the right side with the support. Dorian placed his hands on both supports, arms firm, jaw set with that stubbornness I had seen in every session since the first day, and which, at that moment, was exactly what needed to exist. He stood up. It wasn't fast. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't silent. There was visible effort in every muscle of his body, breathing too controlled to be natural, jaw so set I saw the muscle in his jaw working, but he was standing, with both feet on the ground, supporting his own weight with support on both sides, and for one complete and entire second he stood like that, looking forward, at the window, at Chicago covered in snow outside. Then he took the first step, and the second, and the third. 3 steps. For anyone who didn't know what had happened in recent months, they were 3 steps. For those who knew, for those who had heard the initial diagnosis, for those who had been present at every session, at every refused repetition, and at every dawn before dawn, they were everything. My eyes burned. I didn't let them fall, but they burned. Dr. Vance made his notes with his usual efficiency, said he would return on Thursday, greeted Dorian with a handshake that had more weight than usual, and left. Bram was in the hallway. I heard him close the apartment door with a delicacy he had never used before, a small gesture, almost imperceptible, that was his version of understanding what had just happened. The room was quiet. Dorian was sitting back in the chair, his breathing still deeper than usual, and his gaze fixed on the floor in front of him, not the gaze of someone exhausted, but the gaze of someone processing something too big to fit all at once. I was still standing a meter away from him, my eyes probably giving away everything I had decided not to say. He looked up, saw me, and then did something I didn't expect. He reached for my arm with his hand that was firm, with the certainty of someone not asking permission, and pulled me. I lost my balance, stumbled 1 step forward, almost fell on him, put my hand on the back of the chair to steady myself, and when I raised my eyes, his face was centimeters from mine, and he kissed me before I could say anything. It wasn't a hesitant kiss. It wasn't a question kiss. It was the answer to something we had both been formulating in silence for weeks, and it had in it the weight of everything that had happened since that first morning when Bram had knocked on my door before dawn. I felt his hand rise to my face, large and firm, and something in my entire being decided to stop resisting something that had stopped being a possibility and had become, without me realizing exactly when, a certainty. What happened after I keep the same way I keep the things that truly matter, without ceremony, without report. That night, in that apartment with Chicago covered in snow outside, Dorian Ferrante and I crossed the last line that still existed between us, and what remained after wasn't confusion or regret. It was that specific piece of when something that was wrong finally fits into the right place. The next morning, I woke up to different light in the room. It was that white, diffuse light that snow reflects from bottom to top, that doesn't warm, but illuminates everything with a strange clarity. Dorian was standing by the window, standing, without support, for just a few seconds, looking at Chicago outside with the snow still covering the city and his back slightly curved inward, like someone carrying a thought that's heavy and pleasant at the same time. I stayed quiet, didn't want to interrupt. He stayed like that for a long moment, looking at the city, and there was something in the way he held it. The silence, the window, the snow outside, that was different from all the other moments I had seen him look at Chicago. It was the look of someone who is, for the first time in a long time, simply present where they are. The bedroom door opened. Bram entered without knocking, which he only did in 2 situations, and I already knew both, crossed the room in silence, and placed a closed folder on the table without saying anything. His face was more closed than usual, which, coming from Bram, meant something I still couldn't name. Dorian looked at the folder, then looked at me, then looked back at the folder. He didn't open it. He stood still with his hand on the cover for a moment. With that expression, I had learned to recognize as the face of when something entered the board and still had no name. Bram left without making noise, and the room was quiet, and the snow continued outside, and I lay there looking at both, at the folder and at him, with a feeling in my chest that wasn't fear, but looked enough like fear that I couldn't ignore it. Everything was fine. Except I didn't believe that for even a second. Lena here, that wraps up book 1, and I've already finished book 2. You can get access to it for a really small fee. I thought everything was finally at peace. The routine, the silence of the apartment, the way he looked at me in the morning, before any words, as if I were the only thing in the room that truly mattered, as if, after everything, nothing else could spiral out of control. I was wrong, because while I slept, while the apartment was quiet and Chicago was covered in snow, and I thought the worst was behind us, he opened a folder, and what was written on those 2 pages changed everything. The accident wasn't an accident. The brakes didn't fail. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't carelessness. It wasn't the kind of cruel thing life does without reason. It was a cut. Clean. Intentional. Done by someone who had access, who had time, who had a plan. Someone had tried to kill Dorian Ferrante, and that someone was still out there. As you can see, that was just a little taste of book 2. To watch the full uncensored version, just click the first link in the pinned comment. I'll see you on the other side in just a few seconds. Just a reminder, click that first link down in the comments, and the complete book 2, ad-free and uninterrupted, will be waiting for you. It's that simple. I'm absolutely loving working on book 2, and since you guys are loving it too, I promise there's more to come. This is where you'll find stories that get even steamier, true dark romance. And because this version is getting so much more spicy, the video wouldn't be well received publicly on YouTube. This private space is where I can really show my true essence, and where I feel free to do my best work for you all. Keep in mind that the channel has been demonetized. So this is a way for me to keep my team together and continue bringing high-quality stories to you. I'll have even more updates for you soon. I'll be waiting for you at that first link in the pinned comment.